The Scandinavian languages are traditionally divided into two branches: Western Scandinavian with Norwegian and Icelandic, and Eastern with Swedish and Danish. This division is based on historical grounds and is not as relevant today. Mainland Scandinavian and Insular Scandinavian is more appropriate, since Icelandic and Norwegian are more distant to each other today than what Swedish and Norwegian are now, because of later grammatical and lexical changes on the mainland. Historically, there were two main dialects of Old Norse, Western and Eastern Norse. The typical example of standard Western Norse is usually Old Icelandic and Eastern Norse, Old Swedish. The reality was of course more complicated, with a complex dialect continuum with moving boundaries, which is clearly seen in the documentation of genuine dialects from around the turn of the century. Medieval manuscripts also show a similar, even, gradual shift from Western to Eastern Norse in Scandinavia. Most of the time, this paradigm is quite useful, with Old Gutnish being the big standout, with its radically different vowel system. Gutnish being a small language spoken in a small island in the middle of the Baltic, having its own quite distinctive vowel system and sound changes. It's exactly what you would expect in such an isolated environment. And the Guts have historically always had a strong common identity separate from the mainland, regardless of who owned the island politically at the time. But Gotland is not the only place in Scandinavia where the local speech is radically different, and sometimes in unexpected ways. The upper parts of Dalarna in Sweden have sometimes been described as a linguistic world on its own. A massive dialectal diversity down to parish level, with a long distance from what you'd usually call mainstream Scandinavia, makes the dialects incredibly difficult to understand for outsiders. An unusual combination of archaisms and innovations that can be compared to the insular Scandinavian languages such as Faroese. One of the most famous and recently mostly highlighted dialect is of course Elfdalian, but you have to consider that Elfdalian is a part of a larger dialect continuum. With Elfdalian being studied in depth, which has yielded many interesting observations, which leads to the question, how does Elfdalian fit into the classical Western-Eastern division in Scandinavia? To derive Elfdalian from Old East Norse, which is usually done with most dialects in Sweden, easily becomes a big challenge, since many of the words sometimes better agree with Western Norse forms. And much like many other dialects in northern Scandinavia, it doesn't really fit into one category. The more you dig into Elfdalian phonology and historical development, the more questions you have to ask yourself about its place in the language. One of the most famous features of Elfdalian is that it preserves the semivocalic pronunciation W, much like in English, that disappeared from central Sweden centuries ago, along with nasal vowels from Old Norse, with some continuity even back to Proto-Germanic times. These nasal vowels are a unique source that are only elsewhere found in an old Icelandic manuscript, and with comparison with related languages. The words right and light, Swedish rätt and lätt, do not rhyme in Elfdalian, being rätt and lit. Historically, these are two different vowels, but when you go that far back, you end up in a Proto-Norse period, much like many other unique sound developments found in Elfdalian to this day. Another very old and uniquely Elfdalian sound law is that an A followed by an N and a K always rounds to a short O, like in tok. Similar nasal assimilations are found in all Scandinavian languages, with the word being tack in most of them from an older thank. But the development to a rounded vowel is unique for Elfdalian. A classic division between west and east in Scandinavia is found in the word pairs bro, ko, bod in Swedish. Swedish and Danish have etymologically an O in these words, while Norwegian and Icelandic have U. Elfdalian has U in these words, much like Norwegian, but that's a simplification. One of Elfdalian's most striking features is that it diphthongizes long vowels. E becomes I, U becomes au, Y becomes oi, similar to English and German. But in this case, U, remains and doesn't diffungize. And it doesn't really have the same outcome as historical O. The product of I umlaut of the same vowel with forms like tyr act differently from I umlaut from the etymological U, which turns out as oi, as in maus and moiser. The more you look into these vowels, the more ancient distinctions you find. Y in certain words with I umlaut resists diphthongization, and looking at it, it's not a coincidence. Words like myr and lyda had historically, before the Old Norse period, the diphthong iu, and not the same original vowel as the words that later develop oi in Dalecarlian, and in turn merges with y in all other Scandinavian languages. Much like in Swedish and Norwegian, k and g turn into affricates or fricatives before front vowels in Dalecarlian, but not all front vowels. The word ge, older giva in Swedish, from Old Swedish giva, cognate to English give, is pronounced jeva in Dalecarlian, while the words kenna and gedda keep the stop. It's worth mentioning that many of the words that keep a stop have a front vowel from I umlaut of short a. Another unexpected feature is that short I and e is preserved in many words, where it has either become an y as in Norwegian or a u as in Swedish. Dalecarlian has beg, singa and sicka, where Swedish has bjugg, sjunga and sjunka, and Norwegian bygg, synge and sökke, with the later two examples being English sing and sink. The only other Scandinavian dialect with these vowels preserved is Gutnish. We're going quite far back in time now, almost approaching the Vendel period, around the 5th century. Diving into the historical development of Dalecarlian, it becomes clear that Dalecarlian, and probably other Upper Dalecarlian dialects, had a distinct development far earlier than usually thought, and that these dialects were probably as distinct as Old Gutnish in the Middle Ages. It's hard to imagine such a distinct Norse dialect being spoken in just a few parishes since the Iron Age. The speech area must have been much larger. You have to ask yourself the question, who were the first Dalecarlians?